Towns, forts, countries, and TV shows have been named for this man, but the mystery of who he was remains unsolved. Who was Jacques Laramie? This was published in The West, January 1966, and written by Paul J. Vivdor. A famous western fort was named after him. A western city bears his name. Rivers, counties, mountains, and recently a TV show were named for him. Yet one of the mysteries of the Old West remains: who was this Jacques Laramie, and why are all these things named after him? You could think the question could be easily answered, but it isn't, despite the prominence of the name today. The man's name further confuses the issue. His first name was either Jacques or Joseph, or perhaps something else. His last name probably Laramie. But at least one inquiring historian believes it was Lorimer, and neither of these corresponds exactly with the name that is famous, Laramie. The man, according to most histories and sources, was Jacques Laramie. He was a French-Canadian fur trapper who worked for the Northwest Company. He was supposed to have been killed sometime during the winter of 1821 in his cabin near the mouth of a river now bearing his name by a group of wandering Arapahoes. Or perhaps he was killed by some other Indians. Maybe it wasn't even Indians. His body was left under a beaver dam, and maybe it wasn't. The year was supposed to be 1821. At any rate, now there's a Laramie, Wyoming, a Laramie County, a Laramie River, a Little Laramie River, Laramie Mountain Range, the Laramie Mountain Peak, and a TV show called Laramie. Surely the man must have been born, lived, and died. There is little doubt but that he did. Beyond that, the deeper you dig, the less certain you can be about any specific facts. Many people have spent a lot of time trying to track down the man after whom the Laramies are named. They have, in general, only come up with a large glob of confusion. Let's take his last name. Today's Laramie is generally figured to be a corruption of Laramie, but an earnest and scholarly man named W.J. Gent, who wrote the article on Laramie for the Dictionary of American Biographies, came up with the theory that his name was really Lorimer. Mr. Gent suggests that he was the son of Louis Lorimer, an Indian trader in the Ohio Valley, who later was in charge of a garrison at Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Lorimer's son might easily have worked his way north and went west up the Mississippi and Missouri to the Wyoming area that is so full of Laramies today, and become a fur trapper or trader. Mr. Gent backs up his conjecture with the fact that the 1836 map of Albert Gallatin shows Laramie Peak as Lorimer's Peak, but that's hardly proof, but it's an interesting theory anyways. The first name gets a little more complicated. It is generally thought to be Jacques, and it is generally accepted that he was killed in 1821. But a newspaper man, Matthew Field, who visited Fort Laramie in 1843, getting background material for a new series of articles on the West for the New Orleans Picayune, wrote that 30 years ago a trapper by the name of Laramie was killed by Indians on this stream, which has since held his name. That would place his death about 1803. 2 years before, Field, a traveler named Rufus Sage, had stopped at Fort Laramie, where he belonged to the American Fur Company, and he wrote, "The river received its present name from one Joseph Laramie, a French trapper who was killed near its mouth several years since by the Indians." As usual, when there is a question of any happening in the western mountains, a mountain man gets into the act. A writer named John Hunton reported on the basis of talks with the famed mountain man Morrison that Morrison was around at the time of Laramie's death. He, Morrison, said he was at Fort Laramie when in his teens, but did not know or remember the exact year that was, and that he had spent the winter when an old man, Laramie was killed down at the fort and around here. Morrison was one of the party who went on search for Laramie when he did not come back in the spring as he said that he would. That party went up the Laramie Valley, searching it and all of its tributaries. They found an unfinished cottonwood log cabin on the north side of the river below the mouth of Sabelle Creek, and one broken beaver trap near it, but no Laramie. Moreland said that he learned some 2 years later from an Arapaho Indian that some of the tribe had killed Laramie and put his body under the ice in a beaver dam. Now, there are several interesting things about this version. The original Fort Laramie was known as Fort Williams and had been built by Sublette and Campbell in the year 1834. If Laramie had been killed in 1821, Moreland couldn't have been there then. He wouldn't have been anywhere around there in 1821 since he didn't leave St. Louis for his trip west until 1822. But Moreland, as he got older, grew rather imprecise about dates and had a habit of embellishing stories that he may have heard others tell in a way that suggested he had been where the action was. The usual version is one that appeared in the History of Wyoming, which was published in 1899 and written by C.G. Cowtent. This says that Laramie was a French-Canadian who worked for the Northwest Company, which was engaged in a bitter battle for trade with the Hudson Bay Company. He says that Laramie organized a group of free trappers and they went to new, unfought-over territory in the United States, near the headwaters of the North Platte River. For several years, these men rendezvoused near the mouth of the river now known as the Laramie. Laramie in 1820 decided to trap beaver on the river and went off to do so despite discouraging words from his friends. The next year, his friends found him dead in a cabin 2 or 3 days' journey up the river from its mouth, and accused the Arapahoes of having committed the murder, which the Indians vigorously denied having done. Cowtent's authority for this version seems to be 2 old soldiers who had mentioned the incident in reports they made. One was a surgeon, the other a colonel, but the records showed that they had served at Fort Laramie in the 1860s and 1870s. He also had to rely on what he could pick up from the older pioneers of the area. None of these had known Laramie or had been around at the time of his death. They were just repeating stories that they had heard from others. So Laramie was killed in 1803, if it wasn't 1821. His body was found in a cabin or under a beaver dam. He was either a Frenchman, a French-Canadian, or an American from the Ohio Valley, or perhaps Captain Gardeau's, Missouri, or Cape Gardeau's, Missouri, excuse me. His name was Jacques, or Joseph, but everyone seemed to agree that he had been a fur trapper. The Hudson Bay Company, in answer to any inquiry from a historian, said that their records showed no Jacques Laramie, but there had been a Jean-Baptiste Laramie who had worked for them from 1817 to 1822 in Canada and had retired to live out his days in Montreal. A Northwest Company inquiry showed there had been a famous Laramie who had started as a voyager for this country in 1804 and had worked steadily for the company in Canada from 1811 to 1820. John D. McDermott, an historian interested in the subject, pursuing all possible leads, found out through a third party that a relative of the trapper lived in Montreal. His name was J. Edmund Laramie. After a couple of tries, McDermott received an answer from Laramie in Montreal stating that there was only one Laramie who migrated from France to Canada, and that was in 1708. His name was Jacques, and he settled in the Pointe aux Trembles near Montreal. A descendant settled in Saint Michael de Yamaska in Quebec. He was an ancestor of Jacques Laramie, the trapper who migrated to the United States, who was one of the sons of Joseph Laramie and Jeanne Mondow of Yamaska. The provincial archives of Quebec, on being queried by Mr. McDermott, yielded more clues. The original Joseph Laramie of Yamaska was a descendant of Antoine Fissot Laramie of Boyce City, a master weaver. His son, Jacques, also a weaver, left France for Canada in 1708. One of his sons, Jean-Baptiste, took up farming near Montreal, and Joseph was his son, a farmer at Yamaska. The next contact was with the priest in charge of church records at Yamaska. According to his records, which there is no reason to doubt, Joseph and Jeanne had 5 sons, none of whose name was Jacques. They were in order: Noel, born December 25, 1781, Louis Theophile, born February 24, 1783, Joseph Michael, born June 8, 1874, Pierre Severin, born May 29, 1786, and Louis, born April 16, 1792. And that's where the Laramie quest stands today. It looks as though Rufus Sage was right when he said the dead fur trapper was named Joseph, because a further search of the records makes it likely that all the Laramies now in the New World are descended from Joseph Laramie, who left Blois City, France in 1708. It is quite possible that the Laramie for whom all the Laramies are named, city, rivers, mountains, county, etc., was born and christened Joseph, but became known as Jacques, possibly to differentiate him from his father Joseph. It's hard to say at this late date, just as it is impossible to determine now whether or not he was found dead in his cabin in 1821. At any rate, it seems that a Canadian named Laramie was in the southeastern sector of what is now Wyoming early in the 19th century, and that he was poking around and exploring, maybe even mapping, probably while trapping, in enough then unknown areas that to have his name to be named after him. All the Laramies we now find in that part of the high country were likely related back to him.